Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Dartmouth Chapel.
My name is Nancy Vogel. I'm the college chaplain and the director of the Tucker Center. And we are so honored for our brothers and sisters, monastics, to be returning for a third year. So thank you so much. I want to welcome you not only on behalf of the Tucker Center, but on behalf of the Mindful Dartmouth Initiative, or MDI, which is a group of staff, faculty, alumni, and students working to promote mindfulness-based practices and principles throughout our extended Dartmouth community. We are so happy to welcome these 9 monastic from Thich Nhat Hanh's Plum Village tradition. And again, I want to thank you for being here. I want to thank some of you who were able to return again and again, because that brings depth and friendship. And so we hope all of you can keep returning. Just please make sure, if you haven't already, silence your cell phones. And now I want to introduce Professor Sarah Swenson of the Religion Department, and she will give an introduction.
Good evening, Dartmouth friends and friends of Dartmouth. I'm honored to introduce Brother Fat Blue, Brother Stream, for his public talk titled, Who is Thich Nhat Hanh? I'll leave it to him to answer that question, but to provide some context, Thich Nhat Hanh is the founder of the Plum Village tradition into which our monastic guests here ordained. Thich Nhat Hanh is world-renowned for his teachings on mindfulness and for his peace activism. As a fellow scholar of Buddhist studies, I know Brother Stream has been conducting extensive historical research on the life of Thich Nhat Hanh. Just as significantly, he had the opportunity to practice alongside this beloved Zen master for nearly 20 years in the last decades of Thich Nhat Hanh's life while traveling and teaching. Brother Stream ordained in 2003 after graduating from here, Dartmouth College, in 1997, where he was an English major. He spent several years living overseas, traveling, and exploring different intentional communities, thinking about where and how to live an impactful life. These are the same kinds of questions I hear many brilliant Dartmouth students asking in my own classes today. How do we make a difference in the world? What does it really mean to help others? Is helping others even really possible? How do we balance being informed citizens against finding joy in our own lives when the news can make it feel like the only way to care is to be worried all the time? Thich Nhat Hanh also lived through some terrible and turbulent times that have many resonances with our own. Thank you, Brother Stream, for sharing insights from his life story through your scholarly research and through your own years of monastic experience.
So welcome, dear friends. Can you hear? Okay. So we'll start with 3 sounds of the bell. And I invite you to bring your attention to your breathing. Just relax your body. We have nowhere to go. Sister True Nature is the bell master. And she will allow us to have at least 3 breaths in between each sound of the bell. So it becomes a profound meditation, coming back to ourselves, looking within, and seeing what's going on there, what's going on within ourselves, what's going on around us. So, welcome, dear friends. Thank you for taking time for yourself. It's so important now that we take time to take care of ourselves. And this week, we've come to Dartmouth to not only take care of you, but also take care of ourselves. You see the monks and nuns here. We are 9 of us. And we come here because we have a lot of happiness. And we have happiness because we know how to take care of our body and our mind. We know how to nourish ourselves in such a way that we can water seeds of mindfulness and concentration and insight in our daily lives. And so we can understand what's going on within us and also around us. The title of this talk is Who is Thích Nhất Hạnh? And it's a playful title. It's the name of a course that we offered at Deer Park Monastery this past fall. And I taught the course, and a number of my monastic brothers and sisters also were interviewed for that course. And we'd all studied with Zen Master Thích Nhất Hạnh for a number of years, some of us for many decades. And I can say that even I was Thay's, and continue to be Thay's student for more than 20 years. I cannot answer the question, who is Thích Nhất Hạnh? Because it's a kind of question that we can also ask ourselves, like, who am I? And do we really know who we are? When we are born, we don't get a manual telling us how to take care of our body and mind. And so there are various spiritual traditions that have risen up in this past centuries to help us to deal with this situation of, especially of suffering and pain and hurt that we experience in the world. We have a big question: what is this? Why is there this suffering? Why do I not know what to do in certain situations? Why is there so much killing, hatred in our relationships, in the world, between countries and nations, between peoples? And so I had those questions as well. And when I came here as a student, I was desperately wanting to answer those questions. And what I found were more questions rather than answers. And so for that, I'm actually quite grateful to Dartmouth, because that is really the role of a true higher learning institute, is to help us to ask more questions and better questions. And I hope you continue to ask questions throughout your life. So if I answer the question, who is Thích Nhất Hạnh, one way it could be to say that he is someone who is always asking questions and not willing to just accept what he received. Even from the Buddhist tradition, he was a Buddhist monk. He became a monk when he was 16, and he saw the image of a Buddha on the cover of a journal in Vietnam. At that time, Vietnam was a French colony. This is in the 30s, and he felt that that Buddha image looked so peaceful, so calm, had such clarity and a gentle smile on its lips. And he wanted to cultivate that kind of calm, that kind of peace, to have that kind of, you might say, mastery or sovereignty over himself. And when we speak about mastery and sovereignty, maybe here in the US, it can have many kinds of connotations. But I just invite you to put yourself in the position of a young boy whose father is working for the imperial government of Vietnam, and that government has no real autonomy. It is just serving a clerical role in the French administration. And the real decisions are not made by the people. In that kind of environment, sovereignty has real meaning. It's not theoretical. How can his country, and many of the people at that time were asking, how can we have sovereignty? How can we be our own independent nation? And he had a deep experience as a young man, which was his father helped to settle people in new areas of Vietnam. That was his role in the government. And so he took his sons up with him, his family, to the northern part of Vietnam, a province called Thanh Hoa. And there's a mountain there called the Nui Na, the Na Mountains. And one day his school, he was in a French school. So he came from an educated family. Like I said, his father worked as an administrator. And so he had the privilege of going to one of the French schools, and he excelled in languages. And so he and his fellow schoolmates, they were going on a field trip up the mountain. And they heard that there was a hermit living in that mountain. And he desperately wanted to meet that hermit. And so when they went up the mountain, all these boys, he went off from the main group and went to the place where he heard the hermit's little hut was located. But when he got there, there was no hermit. He suspected that the hermit heard that a bunch of boys would be going on a field trip up the mountain, and so the hermit went somewhere else. But he found next to that hut a well, a spring. And he drank the water from that well. And he was tired from running up the mountain. And so he lay down next to the well. And after drinking, he slept. And when he awoke, he had the phrase in his mind in French, J'ai bu l'eau plus précieuse du monde. I've drunk the sweetest water of the world, most precious, sweetest water. So he had this experience of timelessness by drinking the water in this natural space. And later on, when he reflected on that experience, he said, I did meet the hermit, and the hermit was in the well. So he met what he was seeking. And so we'll come back to that theme again and again, meeting our true nature through an experience of immersion in nature, of experience of immersion in the present moment, of mindfulness. And I think all of us here have had that kind of experience, maybe alone, maybe with others, where we've been in the forest. I mean, here, this beautiful forest. You know, I mainly came to Dartmouth. And my mom actually is sitting here with the smile shirt. She dragged me around as a junior in high school, and I went to a bunch of colleges in cities like Harvard's and Tufts, and I grew up in a forest. And as soon as we stopped here on the green and I looked around, I said, I'm going here. Because I thought this is a beautiful place, and I want to live in a beautiful, natural place. And so Dartmouth is blessed with these beautiful spaces, and one very sacred one for me is up here in the Bima, where now we have the statue of Robert Frost. And I like to go there and just be with the trees and be in that space. So we've all had those kind of experiences of beauty where we felt like totally fulfilled. We don't have any other desire. That's the kind of feeling that our teacher, Zen Master Thích Nhất Hạnh, felt as a young boy on that mountain. And it's a experience that he came back to over and over and over again throughout his adult life. Let's listen to a sound of the bell. I invite you to come back to our breathing, come back to your body, and just you might like to imagine that you have a thread coming out the crown of your head, and someone's just gently pulling up on that thread, and all your shoulders, your head, your whole body is just hanging off of that. You don't need to have any rigidity. Let your body be loose. It's so important to recognize that we are all children of the earth, and that the Mother Earth is present in every cell of our body. When we have an experience of profound beauty in nature, we can remember that we're not separate from the earth. And that experience in others led Thai to have a deep love for his land, the land of Vietnam. And when you see humiliation and important decisions being made without the consent of the people, it's very painful. It's like we are. It's a kind of insult to the land itself. And so that kind of pain is what he and his generation carried in their heart. They desperately wanted Vietnam to be free. And so his elder brother became a monk. They were sitting together, a bunch of the boys, and they were saying what they want to be when they grow up. And some said a scientist, some said a lawyer, some said be in the government. And his elder brother said, I want to be a monk. And then they all changed and they said, I want to be a monk. I want to be a monk. And they all wanted to become monks. So his elder brother, Nha, became a monk. During that time, they were in the north of Vietnam. And then when they moved back to his homeland, which is in the center of Vietnam, called Hue, the traditional capital of Vietnam for the 19th century, and a very kind of stronghold area of Buddhism in Vietnam. So when they moved back there, he wanted to follow his brother in becoming a monk. And so his brother recommended a temple, which became where he eventually, when his parents allowed him after a little bit later than he wanted to, he still went to school for many years. But at 16, they allowed him to finally ordain with what became we call our grandpa teacher. Sư ông Thanh Quy Chân Thật is our grandpa teacher's name. So our teacher's teacher. And I emphasize that not just for you to know certain facts, but because I feel it's important to understand that there is a kind of transmission that happens from a spiritual teacher to the student. And I feel like that understanding has a little bit, not a little bit, has been drastically cut in the West. And there are reasons why spiritual traditions become stagnant and dogmatic. But we should not forget that in the core there is something alive there. There is a kind of way of living that we can learn as to be truly human. That is not perfectly or adequately encapsulated by a kind of completely what I call only secular education. I mean, secular is contrasted with the sacred or the holy. And I think there's a middle way, right? And that's something that Tai came back to over and over again throughout his life. He was the monk who wanted science and Western philosophy to be brought into the monastic education in Vietnam. He wanted to update the teachings, which had become very traditional. You had to learn classical Chinese and chant in the temple in a language that most people could not understand. So the people who came to the temple, they could not understand what was being said in the chanting. And he wanted to bring it into the daily Vietnamese language that people could understand. And all these things he realized in his lifetime. So he was a great reformer of Buddhism. And as a young monk, he was already publishing his poetry in 1949. He'd only been a monk for 5 or 6 years. And he was still a novice monk. So he clearly had this drive to communicate his deep aspiration, something he had touched through his ancestors. I mean, he has a famous ancestor who is also a poet from Hue. And if you go to a family in Vietnam, especially in the center, they'll often have a family temple where they have lists from generations and generations of ancestors. I've had the chance to go to one of my brother's family temple, and one of his ancestors was the invitation writer for the first emperor of the Nguyen dynasty of Vietnam. And because he was the one who wrote the beautiful invitations for people to come, ministers and others to come to court. And that was a high position of honor. And so even today, his family has land that was given to them from the emperor, and they live on that land. So there's a sense of continuation that our ancestors are part of us. And if we are able to live skillfully in this lifetime, we're able to manifest the best qualities of our ancestors. Yes, there is trauma, there is hatred, there is ignorance in our ancestral lineage, but if we know how to live with mindfulness, we can manifest in the present life, in the present moment, the best qualities of our ancestors. And so that's what Tai, what we call our teacher Tai, which means monk, or Zen Master Thich Nhat Hanh, I feel he really realized. So that's another response to the question, who is Thich Nhat Hanh? So as a young monk, he was very talented in memorizing, and he studied very assiduously. And there's a story that when he was he wanted to use his time as efficiently as possible. Sounds very familiar to Dartmouth students, right? And so he was studying the sutra while his teacher was eating. Our grandpa teacher was eating in the courtyard of the root temple which is called Tu Hiu Temple. It means a temple of loving kindness and filial piety. Doesn't sound as catchy as in English. Is Tu Hiu. Tu is loving kindness, and Hiu is like the love we have to honor our parents and our ancestors. So he was standing there studying the sutra, and his grandpa teacher didn't begin eating, and he was a bit confused, and so eventually his grandpa teacher said, "Well, dear novice, could you please go and cut me some bamboo in the bamboo grove?" And he said, "What a strange request." And so he said, "Well, dear teacher, why do you want me to cut some bamboo?" And he said, well, if you cut me a piece of bamboo, then I can split it and I can make chopsticks. And then suddenly he looked and he realized he hadn't brought the chopsticks for his teacher. He was so immersed in studying the sutra that he'd forgotten to bring chopsticks for his teacher. And his teacher, and that story is so beautiful because that's very much the way we are trained as well by our teacher. Many times I was corrected by him, but it was not like direct. It took me a while to reflect on it. And I think, oh, what is Tai saying? Oh, right. And then sometimes it comes a day later, sometimes a week later. I'm still getting them sometimes every day. I think about my interactions with my teacher and I think about, oh gosh, what was he trying to communicate? And so that kind of subtlety is so human. It has compassion because it's a kind of understanding that comes from understanding our own pride, our own stubbornness. And a good teacher realizes that, and they don't try to break against that, but rather they learn to be skillful and appeal to the intellect of their student and live in a way that they model the practice of mindfulness so that the insight maybe comes a bit later when you're sitting reflecting. And that is a teaching of a great Zen master. So Tai, as a young monk, experienced the end of World War II, and then following that, there's a huge uprising in Vietnam. So Ho Chi Minh had declared independence in Hanoi, and the French, after the end of the war, came back to reassert their control of Vietnam. And that fighting took place right in the center of Vietnam in the 46, 47. So the monks and our grandpa teacher had to leave the temple and actually live in the forest. And Tai told the story that they had 2 bottles of soy sauce. And every time they used the soy sauce, they put a little bit of salt water in so they could extend the life of the soy sauce. And they said by the end of their time hiding out during the fighting, there was only salt water left in the soy sauce. They were so hungry, but that's all they had to pour on their little bit of rice that they had and some vegetables they could get from the wild in the jungle. So our teacher also experienced great hunger. But eventually the fighting stopped and they were able to return to the temple. And at that time, his teacher sent him to study at the Buddhist Institute. And so he learned, he met with many monks who were great lovers of poetry. And so he learned to love poetry and to compose poetry. The life of a monk is really suited, he said, to being a poet. And so he always encouraged all of his students to write poetry. He didn't have this idea like you are a poet and you are a scientist or you are a pre-med. Everyone can be a poet if they live their life with beauty and they practice insight. But he also came up against quite a traditional curriculum that he felt was not adequate to what he was reading about. At that time, Vietnamese written in Roman letters with diacritics, it was only coming into wide use, only just coming into wide use. And before that, the literary minority in Vietnam used classical Chinese to write and communicate. But now journals were being published and literacy was expanding all over the country. And so these journals were talking about and translating works from the West, about science, about philosophy. And he and many of the younger monks who were intellectually driven to understand the world internationally and not only from the tradition from which they came. they were reading those journals, and they had a hunger, a thirst to learn more. So there's a longan tree, which is kind of fruit in Southeast Asia. There's a tree, and they had a library on the top of that tree. And they would climb up there and read books on science, even novels that they were not allowed to read in the Buddhist Institute. And so a lot of his young life as a monk was this trying to find a way to bring together the wisdom and knowledge of the West with the ancient practices and traditions of Buddhism and mindfulness and insight from the East. And they one day he and the fellow monks, they rebelled, and they started throwing stones at the longan tree to get the fruit down, while the chanting was going on in the temple. And they did it purposefully so they would get reprimanded. They wanted to prove they were rebels against the order. And as a punishment, they had to kneel. And this is very common in East Asian temples. You have a long stick of incense, and the elder monk who's administering the punishment will light the incense, and you have to kneel on a hard ceramic tile until the incense burns all the way down. And one monk walked by and said, "Are you satisfied, novice?" And he said, "Yes, I am satisfied." Very proudly, because he was determined to show that he knew better. And they started publishing a journal in the institute, which was expressing their aspiration. And eventually, a few of them decided they were going to go to the city, to go to Saigon, to expand their horizons. And so they came together, and they all gave themselves new names. And so actually our teacher's name was Feng Sun, which means to go towards the spring, or to encounter the spring. That was the name given to him by his teacher, but he gave himself this new name, Nhất Hạnh, which means one action. And the Thích it's from the clan of the Buddha, the Shakya. Some of you may know about Buddhism. We call the Buddha the Shakyamuni Buddha. The Muni, which is a sage of the Shakya clan. And so through Chinese and Vietnamese, it comes out as Thích, and that means Shakya. So he is one action of the Shakya clan. It means of the children of the Buddha, the students of the Buddha. Let's listen to a sound of the bell. Come back to our breathing. So in the Saigon of the early 1950s, he already became known as a Dhamma teacher, and he was still a novice monk. He wrote a book on Eastern logic, and later on, when the Saigon University opened after the Geneva Accords in 1954, he started taking classes under another name, and the teacher of the class was using his book to teach the class. So he is very incredible intellectual from a young age. So during this time, many young monks and nuns and lay friends who really wanted a new kind of Buddhism gathered around him and studied with him and learned from him. And he also learned from them. And so he is always in the midst of many, many young people studying, and they they lived in he taught in an institute called Angkwang, which became a center, a kind of locus for this new kind of Buddhist curriculum in Saigon. He went as well to the Central Highlands, which had just recently been opened, and taught in around Dalat, and even opened a school. And it's very curious if you see, you go to the archives in Princeton University, where Tai came as a international student. You look at the transcript. His high school degree is from the high school which he started in Dalat. So he has a sense. There's a sense of not waiting for people to give you a title, give you a job, give you a degree, but relying on your own insight. That is one thing I've received, and I can say that is an aspect of who is Thich Nhat Hanh. It's not waiting around for others outside of you to give you permission or to tell you, okay, now you can do it. It's looking around and seeing where you can help. And sometimes people will yell at you. I get yelled at all the time. But I know that, okay, I need to listen more deeply. It doesn't mean don't do that. It means maybe you're not so skillful, and you need to listen more deeply to those around you. And that's very much the energy of our teacher. We often say the Plum Village tradition, you don't wait to be told what to do. You look around, you see, what are the causes and conditions? How can I help? And this is another way of describing our teacher's life, is asking the question, how can I help? Over and over and over in every moment. And getting deeper insight and learning. Because how to really help the world is not evident. It takes practice. You try and then you fail. But you learn something. There's some success. It's not completely failure. And then you try again and you try new things. So he was teaching young people in the Central Highlands of Vietnam, sometimes going to Saigon. And after the Geneva Accords, so there was a movement to unify Buddhism in Vietnam. And it's what we can, I think, call a nationalistic Buddhism. So if the Buddhist community in Vietnam is unified, then they can have one voice to speak against the colonial rulers and to be truly sovereign in Vietnam. And so after the Geneva Accords, Vietnam is cut in the middle, and hundreds of thousands of Catholics and Buddhists immigrate from the north to the south, leaving behind their land, their wealth mostly, and the north becomes communist. And so Tai is in the south, and he is invited to be editor of the new journal, 1956, called Vietnamese Buddhism. Actually, there's an older monk who is the first editor, but he brings Tai on as a young editor, and then that monk passes away a few months later. And so Tai becomes a very young monk who's now is now the voice of Buddhism in Vietnam. And one of our the practitioners in our community, a Vietnamese American, the scholar Adrienne Minh Châu Lê, she did a study of those journals, and she determined that about 60% of the articles were all written by Tai. He wrote under many pen names. So the poetry, that was in his name, Nhat Hanh. But many other things like folk tales from Vietnam, or something on Buddhist philosophy or Buddhist psychology, he'd have a different pen name for each different type of article. So he's really a kind of incredible amount of activity and energy to find a way to unify Buddhism in Vietnam. And but some of the articles are quite critical of the older generation. And one article in particular, I think it was around 1958, where he basically tells the older monks who want to just keep their kind of little fiefdom in their area of Vietnam, and they don't want to unify or change. If you don't want to unify, then please step out of the way. He said something like that. And a little bit later, the funding for the journal is cut. And he's wounded deeply by that, and also by the fact that his mother, who had come to live with him and his brothers in Dalat, passes away. One of the most painful things in his life. And so he's nursing his wounds from the Buddhist hierarchy and from losing his mother. And he has a little hut in a little town called Bao Lak in the back of a Fukway temple. And he puts a sign on it that says, "Fragrant palm leaves, hermitage." And that becomes a name which is associated with him the rest of his life. He eventually purchases some land from the tribal peoples in the mountain and moves there with an eclectic group of monks, nuns, as well as lay friends who want to live what they feel is a really deep Buddhist life outside of the framework of the temples, a new kind of Buddhist life. And he calls that Fragrant Palm Leaves Hermitage. And that land is still there, and there's still the foundation of the hut he built for one of his fellow monks. That's the original one. I've been there a number of times. And that really becomes the first experiment in building community. And so there's another quality of what I can say, who is Thich Nhat Hanh? It is a great community builder. When I was a student here at Dartmouth, I took a philosophy of education course. And one of my professors, Randy Michael Testa, right outside of, Silby, I think, or Rockefeller Hall. Yeah, he asked me a question. What is a real community? And then he looked around at Dartmouth. Is this a real community? It's not to say yes or no. It's a question. Again, we're asking questions. You might say it's a community, but are you sure? You have to look and ask yourself over and over. And so that became a kind of question that I held in my heart for many years before I knew very much about Buddhism or I'd practiced mindfulness. And I when I left Dartmouth, I had that question in my heart. And I felt like I could not get a job right away or locked into anything because I had that question burning inside of me. And I tried living in many different kinds of communities in Europe, in Spain, in Paris, and I can say when I came back here at around 24, and I'd started practicing mindfulness because it was helping me deal with my own pain and suffering inside myself. And I met at that time the community that Thai had built here in Vermont, the first kind of U.S. center of the Plum Village tradition, Maple Forest Monastery and Green Mountain Dhamma Center. When I went up there, I said, whoever's building this community, they really know. They're thinking not just 1 year ahead or 2 years ahead, but they're thinking 50 years or 100 years ahead about how to build lasting community. A phrase that he, a few years later, received from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., which is beloved community, members of the beloved community. So his first experiment in the late 50s was to live in this community, Fragrant Palm Leaves. And he hadn't really learned about mindfulness yet. And many people are quite surprised to learn that. He had learned the traditional, as I said, traditional way of being a Buddhist monk, which is to chant sutras. And then he studied Buddhist psychology, but the simple practice of mindfulness, of being aware of the breathing, aware of the body, in every moment, whether walking or sitting or lying down, he hadn't really discovered that those teachings were there, but they're kind of hard to find. And it wasn't until later when he just came in contact with the southern tradition of Buddhism, because Vietnam received a lot of its transmission from China, from East Asia. We are part of what we call the Lin Chi tradition of Buddhism, which comes from a great master in China of the Chan tradition, or in Japan they call it Zen. But you have to look very deeply to see the mindfulness there. It is there in the forms of the practice in the temple. But it wasn't much till later in the 60s when he discovered the mindfulness of breathing sutra, which has been preserved in the southern tradition of Buddhism in Sri Lanka and then to Thailand and Burma, and especially the 4 establishments of mindfulness sutra, which I encourage all of you to read. Because for me, it was that kind of manual for life that I was missing. How to be aware of my body, aware of my feelings, aware of my mind, and aware of all phenomena within and around me. That teaching helped me in a moment of great suffering in my early 20s to actually touch joy again. The joy of being alive when I'd lost it, when I was so full of anger and anger towards the tendencies in America, which we're seeing unmasked today, to be honest. And I didn't know a way out. I didn't know a way that I could live my life to be helpful and truly transform the situation. That sutra, we call it in Pali the Satipatthana Sutta, or the 4 establishments of mindfulness, is a great, not philosophy, it's a practical guide to how you practice with your body. You have the situation of a body, you have a mind. What do you do with it? How do you take care of it? Well, if with mindfulness, in awareness of your body, you transform your relationship to it. And you see that there are blocks of suffering within us, of rigidity, that over time with mindfulness, bathing in the awareness of that pain, it actually changes. It becomes more loose, and over time it starts to flow again. And you reestablish harmony in your body and mind. So that teaching he hadn't come on yet. And so all the pain and the hurt that he felt, from the cutting of funding to the journal, from the death of his mother, he didn't know how to heal. And he actually went through what he told us later, a depression. He was invited to go to Japan to speak out as the editor of the journal, and he ended up taking time in a hospital there to heal himself. Kind of like a mental health crisis that he was experiencing. He'd been singled out because he'd been so kind of talented in publishing his poetry and books at a young age. He was singled out, and there was jealousy in the community towards his talents, and he didn't know how to handle that kind of perceptions. Let's listen to another sound of the bell, so we can bring all of our attention to our breathing. You might like to close your eyes for a moment. Breathing in, I know I'm breathing in. Breathing out, I know I'm breathing out. In, out. And one day, one of these fellow members of Fragrant Palm Leaves was arrested in town, an intellectual. The regime of Ngo Dinh Diem, if you know a bit of Vietnamese history, he was the CIA-supported the ruler of South Vietnam. In fact, he never fully acknowledged that Vietnam was divided. He saw himself as the ruler of all of Vietnam. was using increasing authoritarian tactics and silencing intellectuals. Is sounding familiar? And instilling fear in the hearts of people. And he also used religion. His brother was a bishop in the Catholic Church, and so the minority of Vietnamese Catholics were benefiting from Yiem's rule, and so Thai became increasingly despondent in how to respond to the situation. He was teaching Buddhism and getting more and more students. In fact, he had a group of young students he called the Cedars, like the cedar tree that he was teaching in Saigon. But he decided that he needed to understand better these ideologies that were coming into his country from the West. The ideology of communism in the North, the religion of Catholicism in the South. And so he decided to apply for a Fulbright scholarship. And he went to Princeton. And many people don't know, Thai often said that Thai is from the East, but he got his awakening in the West. So the experience of being a special student studying comparative religions in 1961 in Princeton was a deeply transformative experience for him. So coming out of this area of increasing conflict in Vietnam and coming to this place where he often said Princeton at that time was like a monastery. Actually, it was not co-ed. It was only men. And he was in the seminary where the ministers were trained. There's a great article I encourage you to read in the Princeton Seminarian where Thai talks about his experience of 1 year being there. He says he couldn't believe that the men in the classes would put their feet up on the table with their feet pointing towards the teacher and smoke a pipe during the class. Does that happen in Dartmouth now? Maybe we've changed a little bit for the better. And he saw the students running up and down the stairs to get to class. I think that does happen still. It's a very beautiful article that Thai wrote, and one of the earliest articles Thai wrote in English. It's in the Princeton Seminary and the publication. And many of the dean of the seminary, he loves Thai very much, and so they try to find a situation that Thai can continue his studies in the West. And so they find a place for him in Columbia University, and he ends up teaching as well as doing a master's thesis there on what's called consciousness only school of Buddhism, which is or Yogacara Buddhism. Later Thai called it manifestation only, and is a teaching where we see that all of the things we experience are filtered through our mind, and so what we actually respond to are not things outside of our mind, but they are only our perceptions. And it's a deep teaching in how to understand our perceptions and transform them. So Thai did that thesis and was living at Columbia University. So he spent 2 years at Princeton, Columbia, and then the news came that shocked the world: the immolation of the venerable monk Thích Nhất Hạnh, his elder brother. You've probably seen the images. They were kind of seared into the collective memory at that time. People who didn't even know where Vietnam was. They saw the image of this monk burning himself, a photo from a US journalist, burning himself in the streets of Saigon to death, and not moving the whole time, not screaming out, not making any noise. Thai knew Thích Nhất Hạnh and saw he's a very lovely monk, very gentle monk. He's not a violent person. And that experience of seeing Thích Nhất Hạnh immolating himself had a profound effect on Thai as Thai walked the streets of New York City. And Thai did a fast and tried to petition the United Nations to intervene in Vietnam. And we didn't know until Thầy, our teacher, passed away in 2022, but in his memoirs, he revealed that he had made the plan and committed to immolating himself in New York City. He felt that if he immolated himself, it would not be an act of despair, but an act to galvanize the peace movement internationally, to look seriously at the situation in Vietnam and what is driving people to, brother to kill brother, families divided by ideology. But that before he underwent his plan, he met his advisor at Columbia, Professor Fries, and who asked him how his fellow monks were doing in Vietnam. And Thầy told him the situation and how the Yim regime was being even more repressive every day and jailing monks. And Professor Fries asked him, this is in the philosophy building of Columbia. He asked Thầy, what will you do? And Thầy realized he could not tell the professor what his plan to immolate himself. He didn't tell anyone. How can you tell anyone? And the professor said to him, thank goodness you are here to be a voice for your fellow monks, for those who don't have a voice. And Thầy was completely startled. It's like lightning going through his body. And the professor came and put his hand on Thay's shoulder. And he went out of the office. He gathered his papers, Thay, and went down and walked down to 109th Street, where next week, April 11th, they will co-name the street Thích Nhất Hạnh Way. And right there, when he arrived at 109th Street, he abandoned his plan to immolate himself. He saw that his way of sharing the Dhamma would not be through that immolating himself, but through teaching in the West. And so this is this moment. We can enjoy the bell of the tower here at Baker for a moment. In Plum Village, when we hear the bell of the church ringing, we stop what we're doing and we come back to our breathing and come back to our body. Remember that we are here right now in the present moment. It'd be a nice practice to have all over Dartmouth. Imagine if all the students walking across the green would stop when they hear the chime at the hour. So it's 6 o'clock and I'm telling the story of who is Thích Nhất Hạnh is not going to finish tonight. But I want to tell you parts of the story that even those of you who know about Thầy, you might not know, so that you can look more for yourself. Because from this point on, Thầy is asked to go back to Vietnam and builds what's called the School of Youth for Social Service. Thousands of young people come to him. They call it the Little Peace Corps. They're trained to urban youth to go and help people in the villages to have sanitation, to teach classes for the children who have no school. And he builds a movement for revitalization of and modernization of the countryside so that people have a chance to learn. But the situation gets worse and worse, as we know, in the Vietnam War. And eventually he is invited by Cornell University to speak about Vietnamese Buddhism. And he uses that opportunity to come back to the US. And to spring of May of 1966. And the Fellowship of Reconciliation brings him to meet Dr. Martin Luther King in Chicago, Thomas Merton in Gethsemane, Kentucky. Real spiritual leaders who are working for peace. And he speaks out about the situation that the Vietnamese people do not want this war. They don't want to be communists. They don't want to be capitalists. They want freedom in their country. And they want to be able to determine for themselves their future. And he is banned from returning. He learns it's too dangerous for him to return to Vietnam. He might be assassinated. And he spends the next 39 years until 2005 when he can return for the first time to his homeland. So he said he is like a bee cut off from the hive. All of his students there left in Vietnam. And he has to learn how to live in the West and find a home right where he is, wherever he is. And people start coming to learn this practice of mindfulness. And he does it with the practice of mindfulness. He learns how to arrive in his true home with the practice of mindful breathing and mindful walking. So I'll finish there. So this is just a taster. You can't possibly tell the story of Zen Master Thich Nhat Hanh's life in 1 hour, but I feel it's a story the world needs to hear, and we need to learn. And that story will not be. This is Brother Phap Lu's version, right? But each one of us will have our own version, which is intertwined with our own practice of mindfulness and our own awakening. So thank you for listening today. I hope you, like Thai, become a community builder and ask yourself, what is real community? So that we can establish deeper networks of trust with each other as we go through these difficult moments now in this country. We need to really have trust in one another and confidence that we are each doing our best. Because within each of us, there is an awakened Buddha. And if we know how to practice mindfulness, it can manifest. Maybe not all the time, but you can be a part-time Buddha sometimes. And we need, if we have lots of part-time Buddhas right now, it's enough. We don't need full-time Buddhas. If we have community, part-time Buddhas are enough. Sometimes I'm not a Buddha, but my sister is a Buddha. And she can be the Buddha for me. And then other times I can be the Buddha. And so that way we build true community. We don't react against the ridiculous things that are happening, but we, right here and right now, we build real community. So thank you for listening, and I wish you a lot of joy building the beloved community. So I don't know if there are any announcements. We'll just add one point, which is that in the back, amongst the other material there's a brochure which just says Action Wake Up. And so I live at Deer Park Monastery now with my brothers and sisters, and we are starting a training program. It's a spiritual practice and engaged work in the community. It's 15 months, and it's really designed for those who are finishing university, especially, and don't want to get caught into, graduate school or the corporate world straight away. But you want to actually live in community and develop a foundation of a spiritual practice. And so we have a 3-month rains retreat where we practice intensively, just like the monks and nuns, and then 9 months of service, like living in a house nearby the monastery together and seeing how to live together in community, while doing service in the community near Deer Park as well as for the monastery, and then followed by another 3 months of intensive practice in the monastery. And so there are brochures on the back. If you're interested, please, or you know somebody who might be, please take one. And there's, I think, QR codes so you can find out more. We're starting the first group this fall.
I just want to point out there are activities all week long, so there's a schedule in the back of the calendar. Please check it out and come back to the calendars. And then also, we're asking you to check in just so that we can make the case to have more wonderful events like this for the school. So that's why we ask that you kindly check in with them. Thank you, everyone.